Welcome back to all of you. All right, we will start right away with a short video from Conservation International. All of the movie fans out there are going to like this one. This is called Liam Neeson is Ice.
I am ice. I move slowly. I keep the world cool. Well, I used to. But humans keep warming this planet. I try to warn you. I send pieces of me thundering into the ocean. You do nothing. I raise sea levels. You do nothing. It has taken you decades to notice. Perhaps I'm not so slow after all.
All right, another example, as we were saying before, of how we can communicate better about the problems we're facing today. Well, after the look earlier at the potential risks to the world's societies, the world's economies, our fourth session now is going to focus on what kind of management responses and actions can work best to make things better. So can I now call up on stage, please, the moderator of this session, Ambassador Thomas Riley, Head of UK Policy at Covington, please. He'll join us on stage now along with his panelists, Elizabeth McLanahan, Susie Grant, Jerome Chapelaz, Lars Kullerud, and Thorsten Marcus, and our keynote speaker for this session, Jane Francis.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here today. I feel hopelessly outclassed by you all, so I hope you'll forgive my ignorance. This, I think, is actually one of the most important sessions because it's really where everything comes together. How do you manage the tensions in this region, in these regions? How do you manage the geopolitics of competing claims for North and South poles, Antarctic and Arctic? How do you manage the tensions between the economic opportunities and the fragility of the regions? How do you manage the necessity for companies to be able to exploit those regions for local indigenous populations? How do you manage tourism? How do you manage mining? How do you manage the competing interests? And I think this is the session where we should come up with some solutions that we can suggest to manage the feedback loops, to manage the time lags, to manage those economic opportunities, to manage these fragile regions in order to be able to preserve them for future generations. I was very struck by the quote in the documentation about the fierce necessity of now, or the fierce urgency of now. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dame Francis, Dame Jane Francis even, I get it right eventually, who is the director of the British Antarctic Survey, a professor of paleoclimatology, Leeds University, the chancellor of the University of Leeds. I was reading her biography and her involvement with the Antarctic region is legion. So it's a real privilege and an honor to have you with us today, Jane.
Thank you very much. I really like to be known as Jane. Only use the other bits for special occasions. So it's been really interesting preparing for this keynote because I put some slides together beforehand. And it's really interesting how the discussion over the last couple of days has changed some of the thoughts I was going to talk about here, and how some of the conversation that we have has really highlighted and taken much further some of the issues. So this picture here on the slide is actually a picture of the East Antarctic ice sheet. So this is the big ice sheet on Antarctica that people are not worried about at the moment, wrongly I think, because it's such a big mass of ice, up to 4 kilometers thick, that it's kind of, everybody assumes it's sitting on rock and it's stable. But that picture there is some water showing that there is melt beginning to appear on the surface of the East Antarctic ice sheet, where there's huge amounts of water locked up. That's the Nansen ice shelf in the Ross Sea region. So I think the next big research project should be facing the East Antarctic ice shelf in due course, ice sheet. So what kind of variation is there? Times of uncertainty. So we've all heard about climate uncertainty, and I think this slide is about tipping points, the really big changes in climate. I think on top of that, there's also natural variation, and I think this is where scientists and public need more conversation, because there is natural variation in our system. We've heard about how the sea ice has diminished this year around Antarctica, but in other places it's got colder. We've heard from Klaus that his roof blew off his house, and I can understand that because we've had some really bad storms in the UK, which everybody says is extreme weather from the climate warming, but we've also had masses of snow. So climate variability, extreme variability, I think, is a feature of our world at the moment. But this is a really important slide, I think, about tipping points, because we now know that there are critical points in the climate where we really think that the climate will go into irreversible change. So this is from the Carbon Brief. You can have a look at it online, but it shows that the Arctic sea ice and the permafrost is really important tipping point. And in Antarctica, there's a highlight of the West Antarctic ice sheet that I mentioned yesterday. And if they do tip, and everybody seems to think that so we're going to wake up one day and suddenly we've gone into a tipping point, and that's not the way it works. We're probably already into some of these major tipping points, and it's the ones we need to consider carefully and make sure that we are doing some work on right now. We've also heard a lot about the governance of the regions. So I've put this under the heading of policy, because a lot of the work that goes on at this level also contributes, the science contributes to IPCC. We have the Arctic Council that looks after the Arctic regions. It's a place where there are 8 Arctic states and many observers, and they present some really excellent research and discussions around the Arctic. In the Antarctic Treaty, which is something I'm much more familiar with, we have the 54 nations that work in Antarctica that meet up annually, and we have a week or 2 weeks of discussion, but everything is done by consensus, which is fantastic in one way, but in another way it's a very slow engine. And I always think that at the end of 2 weeks, the Antarctic Treaty is still intact for peace and science of Antarctica, and I think that's currently quite a big achievement. There's a lot of discussion about tourism in the Antarctic Treaty at the moment, and all the nations in Antarctica, when we meet in a treaty meeting, understand the importance of tourism. It's a special section of the discussion of the treaty when all the Ministry of Foreign Affairs people are around the table. There are not many scientists in that meeting, but a lot of the really important work goes on in a parallel meeting by the Committee for Environmental Protection, which you'll hear about a bit later, I think, from the panel. And it's that committee that looks at the scientific data that then can enforce some regulations. And I think there was a question earlier on about how we can regulate tourism. I think tourism in the Arctic is probably, if not more important or larger in concern than the Antarctic. But I think the way that tourism can be regulated is by good, solid, robust scientific data that shows whether the environment is being affected, how it's being affected by tourism, and what we need to do to ensure that the environment is protected. So we need more science to be focused on that impact of tourism. So one of the things also the Antarctic Treaty is involved with is the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources, particularly for food resources. And one of the panels, Susie, is on CCAMLR. And this, again, is quite a tricky political situation at the moment, because CCAMLR, again, is about presenting scientific data to enable decisions to be made about fishing and fish stocks and marine protected areas. And again, at this particular time, the last few years has been very tricky. I'll let Susie talk about that. And in the Arctic, I think the really interesting example in the Arctic, which we should all be involved in, is the moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. This area that's not really owned by anybody yet, international waters. And it was really fantastic to see the moratorium signed recently, last year, to allow this area of the Arctic to be kept free of exploitation for 16 years or onwards after review, to allow science to go ahead and try to understand what is there in the Central Arctic. It's difficult to access at the moment because it's generally covered in ice, but there has been some research, I know, by Arvi, and we're beginning to understand what is actually in the Arctic Ocean under the ice. But the fish will go there in the future as the ice melts, and we need to understand what is underneath the Arctic Ocean while there is time. It's 16 years. Science takes a long time to generate big projects. I've seen it takes 10 years for a big science project to get off the ground. So we need to start that now so that we can work with the moratorium. I showed this graph yesterday, and we're always told never to show a graph in a talk to an audience that's not scientific. This one is incredibly powerful. It shows the connection between carbon dioxide and temperature, and it shows with that red line, that stark red line, that we have moved our atmosphere and the CO2 content way out of a position of stability on Earth. And I show this one because a graph like this is in the British Antarctic Survey, and I've taken tours with VIPs and ministers, and if there's one thing they always take a picture of, it's that graph. They understand that this is really important data, and it's a really important scientific message about how we got to where we've got to. So don't be afraid of telling the scientific story to politicians and ministers. They can understand if you explain it to them well enough. And ice cores like this contain a really important message about our climate. They give us the basic scientific data to enable us to understand how our climate functions, how it interacts with other aspects of the Earth system, and how it may therefore change in future. And Jerome will talk about the Ice Memory Foundation, which is about storing ice cores for the future. Ice that is being lost by melting that we need to keep safe for now, and which of course is funded by the Prince Albert Foundation. I also mentioned yesterday about new discoveries. And there's so much, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, that we don't yet know. There's new science to be done, new discoveries to be made. And we need to do the science on these areas quickly because of the changes that are taking place, the natural changes or the unnatural changes that we're causing, but also on the pressure, the economic pressure now in some of these areas. So the last thing we need is fishing to come into an area like this and fish these areas and disturb these areas where we've just discovered them, where we know nothing about the habitat and we know nothing about the lifespan of these fish here. There's another discovery recently. This was made while there was some drilling through an ice shelf. So this is an ice shelf that was 260 kilometers away from the edge of the sea, from the edge of the ice, where there is sunlight and open ocean water. And a drilling project drilled through this ice shelf, through 900 meters of ice, and when the drill bit got through the ice shelf, it went down into open water, dark open water underneath the ice shelf, and it hit a rock. Bad luck for the drillers, they were collecting sediment, but it hit a big rock. And what they found on it are these small creatures here, small sponges and some things that they really can't yet identify. So what are they? Are they new species? Are they going to be something that's really valuable to humans? How did they get there? How do they live under an ice sheet that is so far from open water, so far from sunlight and the obvious sources of food? There's still so much to work out about how these exist, and then what's going to happen to them when the ice sheet collapses. So we need to do a lot more scientific work fast on these new environments and others that we don't know about in both polar regions. And of course, there are economic drivers in both regions as well. I've just shown just one example here of increase in shipping across the Arctic Ocean. It's already happening. Some years it doesn't because of the climate variability and there's still ice around. Some years it's easier to get ships around. It's much more economically viable to take ships across the Arctic Ocean than it is to go all around southern routes. And as was mentioned earlier, ships can cause pollution. They affect the noise in the water for marine animals. And there's other impacts as well of black carbon. There's also seafloor mining, which is raising its head. Somebody told me the other day, they said, oh, we don't need to worry about seafloor mining. It's probably 10 or 20 years away before anybody starts to mine. And yet I've seen pictures of huge, big mining instruments that are already being tested on the seafloor that completely devastate the ecosystems on the seafloor when they suck up all the minerals. These minerals, which are called green minerals, because they are funding all our new technologies. So there is a real trauma there. But rather than ignoring it, I think we need to work, as scientists, we need to work with those companies so that they understand what they're doing, but we can also help. And I think they've got far better technology. They're much more ahead of the game in terms of technology than I think we can get hold of in terms of science. So I think there's a huge scope to work with some of these economic drivers and the companies that are leading them. And finally, I've put this slide in because it's so critical, and there's been so much absolutely brilliant discussion about Indigenous communities in the last session. And as Gunbritta said, Indigenous communities can manage their environments better than we can, and I think that they need to be involved, and they are being involved in shaping the research that goes on into the polar regions. And I think we had a fantastic discussion before in the last session, so I'm not going to say any more than that. So I think there will be some fantastic and very inspiring discussion from this panel of experts here who know about these things much better than I do. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Just before I let you go and take you off the hotspot, as it were, you mentioned a few things there that I think are really important. One of the lessons that we've taken out of the pandemic is that science has a massive role to play in policy making. And yet sometimes science seems to be a bit of an adjunct to policy making. So my question is, how do we make science relevant to policy making and make policy dependent on science?
Probably not supposed to share microphones, are we, this day and age? I think that we need good science, we need robust science that is properly reviewed so that nobody can query it. I've been in meetings where other nations have not accepted scientific data because of just tiny flaws. It hasn't been published properly, it hasn't been reviewed properly, and I think the IPCC does a good job in making sure a lot of the science is robust, it's well discussed, and it's justified in terms of its robustness, if you like. but I think scientific data can inform us on the way forward. But we've got, again, as we've covered in past sessions, we also need to communicate that science properly. It's no good leaving it in scientific papers. We need to speak the language of the people who are listening and who have the power to regulate and to change policy.
I've one more question for you. There is a tension here, and it's a tension that we will discuss with regards to time lags of changes. But there's also a tension between how you make tomorrow's problem relevant today and how you do that using science when, in your own words, science takes a long time. Do we have the luxury of that time to make the science relevant to policy making?
Well, as a scientist and as a leader of a research institute, I would say that it's really critical that we get funding faster. And, and some of the processes I think that scientists have to go through are quite slow. So if there was a way that we could work together faster, I think international projects, international partnerships, and really with ambition and with real passion that can convince funders that this is the way to go, that we really need to do this project urgently, we can change the pace at which science happens. So let's work with passion.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. I'm going to turn to the panel now, and slightly different from previous panels, I'm going to try and integrate you in the room into the discussion. So please think of questions you'd like to ask the panel, and I will come to you. And I'd like this to be a real discussion between us up here and the room. So think about your questions, please. I'd like to introduce the panel. So we have Susie Grant, who is in the middle here with us today. She is a marine biologist and the chief officer in the Standing Committee for the Antarctic, I beg your pardon, treaty system. We have Elizabeth McLachlan, who is the Director of International Affairs and a Senior Advisor in the North Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. We have Jérôme Chapelez, who is the Director of the Institut Polaire Français Paul Émile Victor, and the Chair of the Ice Memory Foundation. I think that's a really interesting thing that I hope we have a chance to discuss in some depth. We have Lars, who is the President of UArctic, and we've mentioned UArctic earlier, and I look forward to hearing more about that from you. And we have Thorsten Markus, who is the Program Manager for Cryospheric Sciences at NASA. I'm going to start, if I may, with you, Susie, to talk about the work that the British Antarctic treaty system does, in particular the role that polar oceans play as a critical component of the Earth system. I'm going to give you 3 minutes.
Okay, is that working all right? Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. It's great to be here. As we've heard in the last days of talks, the Southern Ocean is an absolutely critical component of the Earth system. We've heard about the way that it drives ocean circulation, it transports heat around the globe. It's also a huge carbon sink, and the ecosystem of the Southern Ocean is incredibly productive, and it supports a very large number of ecosystem services which benefit humans all over the globe. We have a huge amount of biodiversity supported by that ecosystem, driven largely by that high productivity and the enormous abundance of Antarctic krill in the Southern Ocean. Antarctic krill play a key role in biogeochemical cycling, so this kind of cycling of carbon through the system, carbon and nutrients, which is incredibly important for climate regulation globally. But these ecosystem services are threatened by atmospheric warming, by warming of the ocean, by acidification, and especially by a loss of sea ice, which is projected to increase in the coming years. Southern Ocean ecosystems and the species that live there have a limited capacity to adapt to change. They are very well adapted to a very cold environment. And as in the Arctic, there really isn't anywhere else for them to move to if things warm up. These ecosystems are managed, as Jane said, under the Antarctic Treaty System, and a component of that is CAMLA, the Antarctic Fisheries Commission, whose aim is to manage fisheries in a sustainable way across the ecosystem. And CAMLR was really one of the first and still quite unique in the way that it takes an ecosystem approach to the management of fisheries in the Southern Ocean. So it looks at the ecosystem as a whole, not just individual targeted stocks. The fishery for Antarctic krill is increasing. It has increased dramatically in recent years. At the moment, the way that it's managed is quite precautionary. The catch limit is very low in comparison to the total estimated biomass of krill, but there is a risk of that catch being taken from specific locations which are very close to colonies of seabirds or other predators which rely on the krill for food. And this is what CAMLR is grappling with at the moment, is how to balance that risk, how to assess where the risk is to the species which rely on the krill, where is the risk to the krill stock itself. This needs to be, it needs a huge amount of information. We need to understand where the krill is, where it's moving to, who's eating it, how much they're eating, how much is safe to be then fished in a sustainable way. And although this is a very precautionary response at the moment, what CAMLR perhaps isn't including in its decision-making is a consideration of how those stocks might change into the future. Krill, as we've said, is very reliant on sea ice. Juvenile krill, it's a critical habitat for them. And if that changes, we've already seen evidence of krill stocks contracting southwards, and that's likely to increase into the future as well. There are other mechanisms which CAMLR and the other components of the treaty system are using to try other management responses. We have management of the fisheries. CAMLR's also implemented a mechanism to protect marine areas which are exposed by the retreat or collapse of ice shelves. So when these areas are newly exposed, and Jane just showed a picture of the incredible life which may be existing underneath those ice shelves, CAMLR has an agreement now to implement very quick protection for those areas where for a 10-year period no fishing is allowed to take place within those areas that have been newly exposed, and that is to allow for understanding of those areas, for research to proceed in the absence of any other human activities, particularly fishing. So removing those other pressures to allow scientific understanding, to allow ecosystems to maintain this resilience where really they have a lot of other pressures from climate change and potentially from the cumulative impacts of other pressures as well, like the introduction of non-native species or pollution. These precautionary responses where we try to minimize the risk as far as possible of any adverse effects before those effects become evident, this is really critical. Another part of the Antarctic Treaty System, the environmental protocol, is also taking action on other human activities. And just an example of that, the emperor penguins are projected to become near extinct within 100 years due to the loss of the fast ice, the sea ice on which they breed. But taking action to minimize those other pressures, for example, human disturbance by visitation, that is critical to allow those species to maintain resilience. So I think all of these management actions have something in common. They all require communication of science into the Antarctic Treaty System to policymakers. And I think that science, it needs to be clear about the limitations. There are uncertainties. Science doesn't have all of the answers immediately. We need to be very clear about where those uncertainties remain, but we can't wait for the information to be perfect. It's really important that action is taken, precautionary action is taken, on the best available information that we have now. And I think we need to build an expectation into management that actions should be both precautionary and they should be responsive as well. We need to continue to collect data and adjust that management into the future where we can, with the expectation that management may need to change. It may need to be dynamic. We may need to shift the boundaries of protected areas going into the future. And I think that building that expectation into management will help us to ensure the best outcomes for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. I think that's a really interesting point about making do with incomplete information. You can't wait for the science to be perfect before acting on it, otherwise it's too late, and your actions are in response to something that's already taken place in the past. But equally, coming back to the point that Jane made, the science needs to be good, otherwise people will pick holes in it. So there's a real tension there. Maybe we'll come back to that. Elizabeth, I'd like to come to you. We've heard about the Antarctic. I think it would be really interesting to hear about what's going on at the other end of the world.
There we go. Terrific. Thank you for the opportunity to attend this very timely conference and contribute to the Polar Initiative and to hear from the scientists. I think working on the policy side, it's always very exciting for me to see the developments that are taking place and how we can then apply that to our work. For those yesterday that were raising the question of how do we get science into the hands of policymakers, I'd like to emphasize that we truly are listening, and we love products such as summaries for policymakers. It makes our job a lot easier, so please keep doing that. It really is important. I also wanted to speak a bit about some of the commercial activities that much of the Arctic to date has remained, I'd say, relatively inaccessible. It's maybe too costly. However, this is changing though because of sea ice melt, climate change, more interest from near Arctic states to try to take advantage of things like rare earth minerals or other natural resources. So while we've been living in this sort of a little bit of a limbo land, now things are really starting to move a lot faster. When it comes to management in the Arctic, it's very different from the Antarctic, obviously, and this is because you have the land surrounding the water. You have 5 of the Arctic states are coastal states, and so they have national jurisdiction, and then you also, within that area, have the high seas. So you have this interesting, I would say almost tension between management that's taking place by the states, and they can individually decide those actions, and then you have the high seas, which are open theoretically to everyone, and you have sort of a different regime of governance actions that apply to that area. I would like to talk a little bit about the Arctic Council. The Arctic states do look to it as the preeminent body that addresses, I'd say, management, cooperation, et cetera, related to both environmental protection as well as sustainable development. Decisions do require consensus of the 8 Arctic states, and we do this in close cooperation, as we heard, with the indigenous people. It's a very unique arrangement, especially considering this dates back to 1996. We also have the participation of observers. That can include NGOs as well as other non-Arctic states. And this is really useful because it brings additional maybe support to our work. It sort of brings them into this cooperative nature. But at times it can also create some differences in terms of what each might want. So it's a very dynamic situation. The way we operate is that the ministers meet every 2 years and they come up with the political declaration. This helps set the stage and the direction and the course of our work, the science as well as some of the responding management actions that are taken. There's 6 working groups that cover everything from conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, protection of the Arctic marine environment, contaminants, prevention, response, et cetera. So a lot of work that goes on. The working groups, they provide a variety of different types of products. They do scientific assessments, but they also make policy recommendations. So it really covers sort of the full scope. However, it's up to each individual state to determine how they implement that. The actions that are taken by the Arctic Council are not binding. It's a little bit different from some of the Antarctic regimes, like CAMLAR, where they take action and they must follow up. It's up to us to voluntarily do some of that work. Also, I would say the Arctic Council, it excludes only one thing. There's one thing we can't work on, and that's military security, which, of course, given some of the recent events, really will pose some interesting situations. The Arctic ministers have always said this is an area of peace, of cooperation, so it will be interesting to see how some of the political situations right now might add on to some of the climate uncertainties that we're already trying to figure out. I just wanted to highlight, because I know some people are wondering, what types of management actions are we taking? I would say the Arctic Council, recently within the last, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, it's produced a number of different products. These range from things like biodiversity assessments and policy recommendations, marine litter and monitoring plans, Arctic offshore oil and gas guidelines. For the question that was posed yesterday about short-lived climate forcers, there's an entire expert group on black carbon and methane. We also have a framework for marine protected areas to try to get more integration within our different jurisdictions. We look at oil spill preparedness and response, and then there's a suite of work that's taking place on ecosystem-based management, although I wouldn't say it's really being implemented in any direct means. I did just want to flag that at lunch yesterday, a colleague posed a great question to me, one that we sort of often get, and he said, is the Arctic Council strong enough? Some suggest that the voluntary nature of the Council's work enables a greater range of action that might not otherwise receive agreement or attention. And they point to the fact that it's really served as a springboard to negotiate 3 legally binding instruments. However, others believe the Council should reformulate itself into something more like a regional seas convention to enable management and governance decisions, monitoring and review of that implementation, and directed financing to do our work. Advocates also believe that such a convention may enable application of an ecosystem approach to management to more holistically address activities in the Arctic. And then just very briefly, I wanted to touch a little bit on some of sort of the broader international and high seas regimes. I would say, I don't know if people are familiar with something called biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. It's international negotiations taking place at the United Nations right now. It's nearing its final stages, and depending on how the text plays out, we could end up with sort of almost a new regime of how to establish high seas marine protected areas, how to apply sort of environmental assessments, and it really looks at things in a more cross-sectoral manner because of the nature of biodiversity that's underpinning it. Also, just Jane helpfully flagged Central Arctic Ocean fisheries, and then I did just want to mention that there are also conventions related to seabed mining as well as pollution from ships, and that is being governed in terms of sort of, oil, sewage, garbage, et cetera, and they do have a working group right now on underwater noise and are starting to address this issue. Most of these bodies do have scientific committees, and in that capacity, they bring some of that science into the fold. However, at the end of the day, oftentimes politics might sort of discard the science or not sort of listen to the science when they make their ultimate decisions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I mean, there's a huge amount to unpack there. I think one of the things I would take away is learning lessons from different, maybe existing management systems in different parts of the world. The other thing I would take away is the danger of geopolitics, and we're certainly seeing that in other regions of the world at the moment, shall we say. I'm going to move straight on to Jérôme to talk about the work that you're doing about ice memory, and to talk about safeguarding ice cores as a means of scientific discovery and learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the frame of this session where we speak about management, ice memory will bring a different perspective. Antarctica is not the problem. Antarctica is the solution. This project, this initiative, finds its birth with Prince Albert II, who came to our laboratory in Grenoble, France, November 2014, yes, for a private visit. And that's when we presented to him this concept. And he said, this is a great idea, I want to support it. And then he asked his foundation to provide the support. And since 2015, this project runs pretty well, with France, Italy, and Switzerland being involved. Other nations, the Russian Federation, the USA, I would say Bolivia, Brazil, and hopefully more to come. What it is about. Jane Francis has shown you probably the key message coming out from ice cores. Ice cores are like a natural library. They tell us about the past. They tell us how the planet behaves. They tell us about the environment, about the climate. And it's not only about ice cores being drilled in Antarctica, like the fantastic record you've seen about carbon dioxide and methane over 800,000 years. There are ice cores coming from geysers from other places in the planet, in the Andes, in the Alps, in the Himalayas, in the Rocky Mountains, and so on. And the problem is, this library disappears. It disappears simply because of global warming. The book disappears. And we know as scientists that science evolves with time. There will be new ideas, there will be new technologies in the future, but there will not be any more the raw material for this science to happen and to provide indications for policymakers in the future decades or centuries. So ice memory is about collecting ice cores from geysers in the world, and not to use them right now, but to transport them in Antarctica, in the coldest place you will find in Antarctica, where we have this French-Italian station called Concordia. The mean annual temperature there is minus 55 degrees Celsius. It's a perfect freezer. Even under global warming conditions, we know that for centuries, for millennia, it will remain cold enough to keep these so precious ice cores, the last remains from disappeared geysers, for the future generations of scientists who will be able to apply new technologies, new ideas on these remains of the geysers. So the process is well, I would say, advanced. We've been able to carry so far 6 drilling operations in the Alps, in the Andes, in Caucasus, in the Altai. We have good hopes to be able to go on Kilimanjaro in next summer, provided that the Tanzanian authorities give us the green light. And of course, we work with philanthropy. I want to thank here the foundation of the University Grenoble-Alpes, which is the auspice of this foundation, Ice Memory, and which works very hard to raise some more funding to make it happen, because of course we need some cash to make it happen. So this is what I wanted to say about this project, and I'm ready to take questions with the public. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the image of this as a disappearing book is a wonderful image. I'm also struck by minus 55, and I was complaining last night that I felt a bit chilly here in Monaco when the temperature got down to 14. So minus 55 is pretty cold. But I look forward to coming back to those points. Lars, over to you next. I'd like you to talk, if you would, about the Arctic Council and conservation action in the Arctic, and talk a little bit about UArctic and how it works, please.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to address this room and you, and I will try to be brief on your questions, and maybe I will add a few small comments in add-on. First of all, to be very short, the University of the Arctic is an outcome of the Arctic Council, already presented very well. And the working group Arctic AMAP, some people 25 years quite on the day today were sitting in a meeting room, probably left behind with too much beer. And they came up with the idea we have to create a University of the Arctic. And here we sit 25 years later, which is the umbrella organization of more than 200 universities. We have 65 different working groups uniting more than 1,000 researchers, and there are a few hundred students every year on mobility exchanges between Arctic countries with funding we have from governments. We would like to have that number much higher. We know it needs to be higher. And we have been so lucky that we've also been partnered with the Prince Albert II Foundation since 2010, and we have many nice visits and stories with that. So it's a very good cooperation, and the basic idea is, of course, everybody know that as we get older, we need the next generation to get trained. And the idea with UArctic, because we created in cooperation with the indigenous peoples, it is that it is about to do it in the north, for the north, but also by the north, with the rest of the world. That's the kind of fundamental values of us. So it's not about we come north and tell the people of the north how to live, but it's they build their knowledge. So I will deal with some of the key questions here with that as a background. Also, I would like to mention that most of the young researchers you see here come from the Arctic member institutions. So they are good ambassadors for the kind of education programs my members have. Conservation in the Arctic, management response linked to that. I think we have a fundamental challenge. A government seems not to be very good at established management systems because they have the conflict between themselves. Trying to establish conservation system in a system like the Arctic Council, which requires some kind of consensus between states, is even worse. And we all know that we need some kind of conservation, and we also learned, at least for the Arctic, what you're supposed to protect is the homeland of somebody, it's the pastures of somebody. It is not wilderness. It is the homeland of some people who have been managing this for thousands of years. So we need a different regime. And one actor that we really need to this is the business community. They have probably much better ability to act fast, go together and do something, together with the peoples of the North. So that's a little suggestion around that. When it comes to climate understanding and research, everybody here talk about it. We need more resources, we need to do more. I think today it's very important to also mention the concept of science diplomacy. There is an opportunity for the science and education community to actually think long-term and not short-term gains, as some state leaders do. So that's an important role for us to play. But we don't need to spend a lot of energy on that. But there is, maybe we need action today, based on knowledge we have today. At the same time, researchers need more resources to study things better. And we need, when we make a decision today, understand that the decision we make, we might future research show that was a bit stupid, or a bit off, or extremely off. But we need to live with that, and accept that, and how to communicate that to the people, and let them accept that reality. I think that is a responsibility on the science community, as well as politicians. Finally, the poles together, I now spoke from the Arctic point of view. We had about 12 years ago the International Polar Year. It was mentioned yesterday, we need really the next International Polar Year, not because we're going to do all the science in 1 year, but more like a flagship. So as Jan Gunnar mentioned, maybe after the polar decade, it's a perfect timing, 32, 33, 25 years after the previous polar year, that we go together to make that happen as a driver and as a kind of umbrella for all good mosaics and other good ideas in Arctic and Antarctic. And I ask EASA and UArctic together with the APEX and have suggested to do that in the Arctic. And I know that we will get people from SCAR to join us and develop that idea, and then we go to nations and countries and make them buy in. There is an interest in the Arctic Council for this, so that's end of my suggestions.
Thank you very much. I found that really interesting. I like the idea that actually you should be prepared to live with risk, that you take a decision today that proves to be the wrong decision in the future, but actually it's better to take that decision today than wait until the evidence in the future, because actually waiting is just not acceptable at the moment. We can't afford to wait. So I think that this kind of comfort with risk in policy making is really interesting, and how you base that policy making on science, but accepting that the science itself may change. So I think there's a way in which you bring policymakers around to the idea of being comfortable with risk. And I know, having worked with ministers, they hate risk. Torsten, I come to you last, but by no means least. NASA, what on earth is NASA doing? I mean, you do space, don't you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, maybe we are mostly known for, exploring galaxies, other planets, sending people on the moon. But your comment is making a point already. We should be known also for doing Earth science, because NASA Earth science is very important as part of NASA's portfolio. While the planet Earth is very important, we're all on it, except for the few people on the space station, and they probably don't know right now what's going to happen with them. That's a different story. So yes, NASA Earth science is it's a very big part of NASA. emphasis, of course, sending satellites into space that observe the Earth. And the importance of the polar regions is so well recognized that some of our satellites are dedicated to make measurements of the polar regions. For example, 3 years ago, we sent a laser into space that measures the height of the ice, the height of the ice sheets, height of the sea ice, with unprecedented precision. With these measurements, we can now see how the ice sheets are changing in height at the centimeter level. That's the precision we need to better understand what's going on with the ice sheets, what's going on with the sea ice thickness. But most of our satellites are polar orbiting satellites, so they go around the pole 16 times a day while the Earth spins underneath. So we have lots and lots of information of the polar regions. We are lucky in this regard. And many of the data records that we see that are the proof, are the record for polar change, come from our satellites. The shrinking Arctic sea ice, that's a satellite data record. The mass loss of the ice sheets that Eric Vigneault yesterday showed, it's a result of our satellites. We also make sure that the data that we send to the public are understandable, are in formats that are usable to the scientists as well as to the layman users. All of our data that NASA is generating, all of them, are free and openly available to the public, to everyone on Earth. It's not even restricted to people in the United States. We are paid for by the taxpayer, and we give all of our data back to the taxpayer. It's a very important aspect of NASA, and I'm very proud of it, that all of our data are publicly available. In addition to sending satellites into space, to generating the data, we also have a very big science portfolio. We are funding researchers to actually do science with the data, to improve models, to improve our understanding of polar processes in our case, to help make predictions of the future and the fate of the ice sheets, of the sea ice in this case. And some years ago, in the United States, we developed the Interagency Arctic Research and Policy Committee, and Larry Hinsman, for that matter, is the executive director of that committee. And the idea of that committee is, because the Arctic is changing so fast and of incredible importance to so many agencies, this committee was formed to make the different agencies interact with each other. We have agencies, whether it's the Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, the National Science Foundation, we all talk to each other. And for us, NASA as a data provider, it's great to hear what are the data needs for the Environmental Protection Agency, for the Department of Transportation, as the Arctic changes so fast. And in terms of informing the public, informing the stakeholders, it's very important for us to inform the public what accomplishments NASA-funded scientists achieve. And I ask all my scientists that I'm funding, please send me your highlights so that we can do a press release, that we can inform the public of the great science that is coming out of NASA-funded science. And we also put a lot of effort into generating animations, pictures, graphs that help educate the public about polar processes, about changes that we are seeing in the polar regions. All of these animations are as well publicly available to everyone who wants to download the data. And as a matter of fact, here's my 2-second commercial. If you go to SVS, Scientific Visualization Studio, svs.gsfc.nasa.gov, all of our animations, plots, and some of them you saw in the science talks yesterday are all available there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's really great to make data publicly available. And I pick up on one thing you said, and I'm going to try and link that to our two speakers, because I'm going to ask our emerging scientists to come up to the stage and talk in 2 seconds. But I think if you make data available to people, you convert people into activists. And I was struck in Glasgow, the energy that came off the street from the activists, and it's that energy of the youth, the passion, the anger in many respects, that actually should be the catalyst for faster working. And I think a lot of that energy, a lot of that anger, a lot of that activism comes from better education, from pushing out data into the public, from helping people to be more aware of the challenges in front of us. And that leads me to Prem. Can I ask you to come up, please? So Prem is from the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, and the British Antarctic Survey, and the WWF. And I'd really like to hear from you, Prem, about your thoughts on what you've heard, but also a little bit about your story. Thank you very much, Prem.
Hello, my name is Prem, and I'm here today to talk to you about seals from space. But before I get into that, I realize that we're coming to the end of the symposium. It's a Friday afternoon, and now the experts have all finished talking, it might be quite tempting to start going onto Twitter instead of listening to an ECR. So what I've decided to do is throw a few questions out in my speech, and the first of all, I want to do a pop quiz. So I'm going to play some sounds, and you have to guess whether those sounds are the sounds of seals or the sounds from space, because I study seals from space. Is that good? Yeah? Okay. First sound. What are we thinking? Seal, space? You can all shout out. Seals. Don't be shy, everyone. Seal, space, what are we thinking? Seals. Okay, yeah, that's a baby Weddell seal, so we're starting off easy. Well done. Okay, round 2. What do we reckon? Space, seals, just shout out. You're a very quiet audience. Don't be scared. I'm not gonna. Nothing's gonna happen. Okay, thank you. Yes, that is space. Well done. That is a sound. So at our base in Halley, we have a space weather observatory with a low-frequency radio receiver, and radio waves which are emitted by our planet, we can turn into audible sounds, and those sounds you just heard are the radio waves related to the generation of the auroras, the southern lights. All right, this is the final round. Don't be scared. Just shout out answers. Okay, yeah, well done. I didn't expect that answer. Yep, that is an adult Weddell seal, and I can all show you the videos afterwards. But really, that was just to make sure your all ears and eyes are on me. But now I've done that, I actually want to start with an apology. So I had planned to talk to you about seals from space and my journey to becoming a polar scientist, and talk about how amazing it is that we have this satellite imagery now with such a high resolution that you can not only see seals and baby seals, but you can even see blood on the sea ice from where a seal has given birth, all the way from space. And I was also going to touch on, my sort of upbringing, being a typical inner-city British kid, whose main way of engaging with nature really was through playing video games like Pokemon and watching David Attenborough documentaries, to now becoming a polar scientist, where I guess my main way of engaging hasn't really changed, except for the differences. I do it through laptop screens instead of video game consoles, and I'm lucky enough to now work on the sequels to some of those documentaries I grew up watching. But yeah, as I mentioned, that's no longer the focus of my talk, and as I said, there's a few questions to the audience. There's 3 questions in total, and this is question number 2. What am I holding here? Again, don't be afraid. Glasses. Glasses, but with a arm missing. So as I was writing my original speech yesterday at the last minute, one of the arms decided to fall off, and I couldn't really see my laptop screen anymore. And then I thought, well, it's fine. I'm a PhD student. We deal with things much worse than this. I will persevere, and I will just balance these on me and carry on. But, you know, the glasses continued to fall down, and I was left half blind. And I think the only thing more stressful than doing a last-minute speech is doing a last-minute speech while you're sat in between two leading polar scientists. So anyways, as they were glancing to me very politely, watching all of this unfold, and the glasses fell off for the 8th time, I think my soul was fully destroyed, and I just began to gaze out and just ponder what I was doing with my life at that moment, and also ponder the condition of ECR students, where, you know, I'm having to play all these sounds to make sure I'm being heard and no one's on Twitter, and, well, yeah, you know, dealing with conditions like this where my PhD stipend probably doesn't cover broken glasses. But then I thought, you know, I'm quite privileged to be here in Monaco talking to you, and to even go from being a student to a polar scientist in the early career stage, you know, it's a very, very lucky position. And then I sort of wondered to myself, well, you know, who has the opportunity to become a polar scientist? And as we've heard earlier on, the polar science community is very, very small considering the big tasks we're dealing with. And the fact is, you know, it takes a lot of privilege to just get here. So that means we have a field in which it isn't those with the capacity and skill to become polar scientists and the future leaders to deal with the issues. It's those who have the opportunity to do so. Well, how can we change this? It's actually quite simple. One step is to change the image, and then the other step is to create opportunities. And I started a group called Polar Impact, which is all about highlighting minorities within polar research and to help those from non-traditional backgrounds enter polar research. And, you know, just to touch on the image of a polar scientist, I think we're treated as rock stars within the science world. We've seen a lot of the clips we've seen. It's very all action-packed. And even when we talk about ourselves as polar scientists, we often talk about how privileged we are to study the polar regions. And on the surface, that seems fine. What's the issue? Well, when you go to schools in London and less privileged areas, and you talk to school children, and you talk to them about what you do as a polar scientist, the response from the children and even the teachers is not to ask you, how can I be a polar scientist? It's just to say thank you for sharing, you know, this really unique opportunity. And this underlying sense that they're talking to you as if you're an astronaut, where it's like, I know humans do what you do, but not us. And we really need to change the image where it's everyone should be able to engage in polar science, not just the privileged few. And to do that, we really need to, like I say, change that image. But once we've done that, we then need to start providing opportunities. And again, with my group, Polar Impact, we've managed to do that on a very small scale. We've helped train students up to use satellite imagery to look at seals and penguins during an internship at Bass, and on the final day, they witnessed the discovery of brand new emperor penguin colonies, leading to a Nature paper. And then we also connect them to, you know, Netflix, Nat Geo, BBC, to start appearing in these documentaries about the poles and make it less about the West exploring these unknown regions, and also, you know, having people who live in those regions talk about their experiences within the poles, as well as having them act as leading scientists on the camera. And I come to my final question. Does anyone know what I have here? It's a packet of red pills with some oil in it. Would anyone like to take a guess from the audience? Krill oil. Yeah. So this is omega-3 oil from Antarctic krill. And we've mentioned the connectivity of how connected we are to Antarctica, and, you know, we're connected in all sorts of different ways. And for me, one of my favorite ways of showing that connectivity is the fact that, at least in the UK, most people are only 1 hour away from being able to go pick up some resources from Antarctica. There's probably teenagers in Glasgow and London who are part of the Antarctic economy when they go buy these. So, you know, even though there's lots of people who don't think of themselves as being connected to the polar regions or can be polar scientists, we're all connected to it in a much deeper way than we realize. And I guess, you know, that point of connection, for us to really develop the most robust and effective plans to adapt to climate change, we need to have people from all levels of society engaged in polar science. And that doesn't mean just consulting indigenous people. That means actually having them lead the science. But the good news is we know how to make that change. We know how to do it. It's quite easy. There's lots of VCRs, as you've heard in the talk, already doing that. What I want to ask is for all the leading polar scientists to give us some help in this and take the burden off our shoulders. Because the truth is, I don't do the work I do to help increase diversity and help make it a more equal field because I want to. I do it because I have to. I'm a PhD student who's trying to study seals, and I would much, much rather spend my time studying seals than having to worry about all of this. I'm not some sort of Mother Teresa that's out there to help people. I'm just doing it because it is essential to saving our planet. And with that, I'd like to end by saying, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that, it's quite easy to make these changes. Please come to us if you're not sure how. We can advise you on how to do that. And even if you don't take that away, and the only thing you take away from this talk is that Antarctic seals sound bloody amazing, I'll still be over the moon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prem. Would you come and join us? The other thing I'd take away from it is always travel with a spare pair of glasses. No, there's a serious point. When I was in Morocco, we used to travel around Morocco and we'd see these kids playing football, and some of them looked to me like the next Pele, but they were never ever going to be picked up. They were never ever going to be part of the Moroccan team and seen on the international stage because there wasn't an organized system. This is no criticism of Morocco. There was no organized system for going out and identifying those children and bringing them into the team. And I always thought, what a missed opportunity. And I think your point, Prim, about the image of a polar scientist, about involving women in science, about involving ethnic minorities in science, is not that that's a good thing to do. It's not only that that's a good thing to do in its own right, but because if you don't do it, you risk missing the opportunity of the next and future Jane or any of the other distinguished people on this panel. I'd like to ask Helen Millman if she'd come up as well now, please. Helen works in the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, and I'm hoping that she will demonstrate the same passion that Prem has demonstrated and the ambition to drive change.
Well, I'll try to. Hello everyone, I'm Helen and I'm an Antarctic ice sheet modeller. I come from Devon in the southwest of England, and my family have been in Devon since before the Norman Conquest in 1066. So we haven't moved far, and I definitely don't come from a long line of polar explorers or adventurers or anything like that. I became interested in Antarctica when I was around 11 years old, and I saw the BBC documentary Pole to Pole with Michael Palin. I don't know how many people have seen that. Put your hands up. Yeah, there's like quite a few people here. So you will probably remember that you saw Michael Palin sitting on the toilet in the middle of Antarctica. And I thought that this looked like the best loo in the world. And I started to dream that one day I too would be able to go to the toilet in Antarctica. And it was this that inspired me to go and do a geography degree. So no sort of very worthy ideas about saving the planet here. I followed this geography degree with a master's in glaciology, and then I moved to Australia to do a PhD. And part of my PhD involved fieldwork in Antarctica, and very luckily I ended up in exactly the same part of Antarctica that Michael Palin went to when he was filmed sitting on the toilet. And sadly, I don't have film footage of myself sitting on the toilet, but they did give me, I do have a photo of the bucket, that they gave me to wee in. So that featured on my Christmas card last year. My research has focused on Antarctica during the last warm period in the Earth's history, and differences in the Earth's orbit 116,000 to 125,000 years ago meant that the globe experienced similar temperature increases to those we're experiencing now. We know from the geological records that peak sea levels were at least 6 meters higher than they are at present, and they may have been 18 meters higher or more. And this means that Antarctica must have made a significant contribution to sea level rise in the past. And if it happened before, it can happen again. Sea levels are projected to rise by 0.5 to 2 meters in the next 80 years. And at present, 500 million people live within 2 meters of sea level rise. So within one lifetime, we could see an unprecedented refugee crisis that dwarfs the one we are seeing today. And I've recently been trying to explain these challenges to my local MP, and this is an insurmountable challenge in itself, because in common with most other politicians, he doesn't have a scientific background. And even though he's a similar age to me, he he really doesn't know anything about anything. He's very good at talking about things, but whether he knows what he's talking about is a different matter altogether. There's no academic rigour in politics, or not in UK politics anyway. In Westminster, facts are flexible, and if they don't like what one expert says, they'll either ignore what all the experts say or just find someone who'll tell them what they want to hear. And against this backdrop, I'm very pessimistic about our ability to tackle climate change. And I was wondering that perhaps more scientists should become politicians, because if you can't beat them, why not join them? And I'm slowly coming to the conclusion that maybe I'm going to have to go and become an MP, go up to Westminster, get in that chamber and sort them all out. So thank you for listening, and I hope I can count on your vote.
I didn't realize this was going to become a political campaign. We already had NASA saying, look at our website. Now it's you saying, vote for me. I mean, this is fast getting out of hand, and I blame the moderator, who's clearly not done a very good job. I think the question about how to make this relevant, Helen, would you like to take a seat at the end there? Is the question we come back to time and time and time again. I met some people over a drink last night, and incidentally, I don't think it is possible to have too much beer. And we were talking about sea level rise, and they said, you know, sea level rise could be this much. And I said, well, that's the height of 2 pint glasses. You know, for your politician, that's just a high tide. You know, the concept that when you overlap a table by 1 millimeter with water, the whole table floods, it doesn't percolate. So I think the question I'd like to start with is, we're here to talk about how you manage uncertainty in fragile regions, but you can only make management of uncertainty a reality if you can actually make this relevant. So I'm going to go through the panel very quickly. I'm going to start with you to talk about, yes, please, about how you, sorry, I will give you your name, about how you make this all relevant to politicians and how we can use that process of making things relevant to actually manage the responses in the face of uncertainty. Thank you.
Thanks. No, first off, I would just like to mention, in terms of managing for uncertainty, all the states in the Arctic and probably the Antarctic as well have agreed to the precautionary approach. It goes back to the Rio Declaration in 1992, and that basically says, you know, we shouldn't allow uncertainty or a lack of sort of full scientific knowledge stop us in the face of sort of irreparable threats and harms. So we do have that ability to take action now, and we can do it in a manner that's adaptive action. In terms of how do you appeal to sort of the audience or the politicians or others, I mean, I was just impressed. We had 2 people who engaged sort of through humor, through sort of tactics, ways of drawing you into their world and what they're doing and hearing and listening and understanding. So I think we need to take advantage. We heard yesterday, field trips work. You know, take the politicians out so they can actually see these and have a tangible relationship. So I think those might be some of the things that I would suggest. Thank you.
Susie, do you want to have a go at the same question?
Yeah, I think it was... Thank you. I think yesterday, I think it was Bruce Forbes who used the term mutually respectful dialogue. And I think there has to be a dialogue between scientists, between policymakers, between the public, that is open and respectful. And there are too often, we see this, certainly in my experience in the debate on marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean, the discussion has become extremely polarized, and there is very little dialogue, there's very little exchange of ideas or development of new approaches, perhaps doing things a bit differently. There are 2 sides which are not really coming together. And so I think to really get these messages across, there has to be a different environment where people feel that they can be open, honest, they can be clear about what their concerns are, clear about what the limitations of science are as well. You know, we don't know all the answers, as I said earlier. You know, how can we be open about that fact and still make some progress. So I like that term of mutually respectful dialogue that we heard yesterday. I think that's something to try to take forward and to make space for that. But that does include, as these two speakers have so eloquently said just now, it does include making space for all the voices to be heard and trying to draw upon people who perhaps haven't been engaged in dialogue, whether that's because they don't feel themselves to be in a position to develop into polar scientists. From children, they don't see that as a career path for themselves. But I think if we can open this up and try to demonstrate that there's room for all of these voices at the table, then I think that will help.
Thank you. It's really interesting. You cannot be what you cannot see. But you've talked about sort of mutually respectful dialogue, but also the question of challenge. And I think, Lars, you mentioned the question of the challenge of with us and about us. And there seems to me, I mean, I think actually one of the themes that's coming out of this session is how do you manage tension, actually, different tensions between competing interests. And I just thought I'd ask you if you can elaborate a little bit about that when it comes to the question of Arctic governance, conservation research, education, access to resources. And then I'm going to come to the floor, so please be ready with questions.
Thank you. It's actually very complicated. With us and about us, or for us, by us. Because who has the right to define a problem? Who has the right to go on the land and find the answers? As a trained scientist, I would say, if there is a question in my science, I would go wherever I need to pick data to find the answers to that question, driven by curiosity. And nobody could stop me just because it's their homeland or whatever. The world should be like that. On the other hand, I think we have this problem that we sit in meetings like this very often, and actually this meeting is not like that, but very often, and we define our problems based on our reality understanding, and we don't end up asking the peoples of the North, those who live on the land, what they think is their problem and how they would like to approach it. And maybe they have a totally different idea on what's the problem, how to deal with it, and how to approach it, and also what kind of solutions are possible to think about. And to produce that understanding, at least one thing which I have observed is fantastic, maybe outcome of the Arctic Council, maybe out of change in the science community and everywhere. We now can sit here and talk about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, other knowledge systems, not that the science is so much better than the others. But we still haven't solved from either side of that equation how the dialogue between the two works. It was described very nicely in the previous session. If you're an indigenous person and somehow don't feel consent what happens, you just shut up. If you are Dane, you just speak. We need to train the scientists to understand that other way of dialogue. We need also those who go silent to actually speak up. And that is a role in a construct like my organization, because we have a big responsibility, because all these universities, they train those who become the future politicians, those who become the future decision makers, the future business people. And if they don't carry with them this attitude and understanding, we do have a big problem also for the coming generations. So the most important is maybe to do exactly what we've seen here. This young scientist, you, go on the stage, speak. You learn something from coming here, I'm sure. We in the room learn a lot, and we need to get the indigenous peoples on board in some kind of dialogue and listen more. I have one more group I would like to attack a little, and that's the media. I think they have, and they also trained in our school, so it's all fault anyway, but they tend to have this super drive and search for the conflict. I mean, we don't need conflict, we need dialogue. And dialogue is maybe we disagree. But we cannot have this 2 minutes conflict thing all the time. We need some places to sit down and try to understand each other. And maybe also those who have the role of communication, the media, should be better at that in some areas at least. Conflict is okay, else. Sorry for them.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yeah, I thought we would.
It's rather a comment, if you allow. It's Jan Gunnar Winter.
Yeah,
it's
but
about
brief.
Yeah, sure. It's about agreement banning commercial fisheries in the Arctic Ocean. I think it's relevant for the discussion. It's a unique agreement. It's the first agreement globally on fisheries that bans something before it started. It's also unique in the way that it is non-Arctic nations into that agreement. But I just wanted to put the focus that when Jane showed the map, it was a red line showing the 200 nautical miles from coastal states. But the reality is that at the end of the day, there will be two probably loopholes, much, much smaller than what we saw on that map, that will be high seas in the Arctic Ocean. So this agreement is a beautiful instrument and it's unique, but we should also know that it's the coastal states that at the end of the day has the majority of the responsibility for a sustainable fishery management in the Arctic Ocean. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Well, let me throw that back at you, because one of the questions I was going to ask the panel is about MPAs, marine protection areas. Is that the right way to go, do you think? Could we do more? How do you police them? You know, you raised this, and I thought the map was excellent, but question back to you, what more can we do to encourage this? I mean, I'm afraid you put your hand up, you asked for it, so.
Thank you. I think we need to improve when it comes to marine protected areas around the world. We talked about the Ross Sea and also when it comes to the Arctic. So that's one side of it. So we need more of it. We also need a sophisticated approach, so we are not running only after percentages. I mean, the whole world has now decided, more or less, that we would like to have 30% protected marine areas. That might be good, but it could also be a way of slipping around if you are not protecting the right areas in the right way and so on. So, and that's where science comes into play, I think, to have a sophisticated voice in this discussion, so not governments are actually making it easy for themselves by making marine protected areas, but they really are not so valuable. So it's more to that story, and back to what I said yesterday, the world is complicated, and we need to raise our voice to tell politicians and others that everything is connected, it's integrated, it's complicated, and we have to find the intelligent solutions. But to your question, yes, of course, we need more of the MPAs.
Thank you very much. So yeah, absolutely. I'm sure the panel's got plenty to say about that. I'm going to whistle through, starting actually at the end to involve Helen and Prem as well. Thoughts around marine protected areas, thoughts around how you involve people in the debate. I thought the ice cores question was really interesting. I thought that making data available to public and getting people involved. So Helen, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to whipple through the whole panel. So if you don't have anything to say, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know much about marine protected areas because I'm an ice sheet modeller. I do know that Britain has one of the highest percentages of marine protected areas in the world, although they still allow bottom trawling in them, don't they? And probably that should not happen and expand to other parts of the world. Probably global diplomacy is a good thing to work on in that respect, kind of exporting our conservation to other parts of the world, particularly China and places like that.
Again, I don't feel really qualified to comment on this, but I'll try. I think when it comes to MPAs and a lot of our management practices, and again, on Helen's point of exporting, from what I understand with a lot of the practices we do within Antarctica, I think Susie can comment more, is we've worked with the South Georgia government to reduce the amount of seabirds we catch as bycatch, and I think it's been almost eliminated to just there are no seabirds more or less that get caught by bycatch, and those techniques are being exported to Japan, I believe. But just sort of commenting on the fact that Antarctica perhaps gives us a bit more freedom and a bit more space to try out new techniques and develop new ideas which we can then export outside of the polar regions, I think it's quite interesting. But then in terms of how do we engage more people in the debates with MPAs, I think within the Arctic, it's a lot more easy because there's a lot more vested interest from communities and industries within Antarctica without an indigenous community, and it being perceived as being so remote and far away, it can be quite tricky to get people to realize that they are connected to you know, what happens in Antarctica. And I suppose one of the ways you can do that is just point out very basic things, like you can go to a pharmacy in the UK and you can buy resources from Antarctica like krill oil, and just showing people how connected they are and how they are already part of the economies that work within Antarctica and the resources that are extracted there.
Thanks so much, and great question posed on marine protected areas, and just a few points to make. First, yes, I mean, you want a quality marine protected area, so very much appreciate the comment of, you know, how are you making sure that you're getting maybe representativity, you're getting the highest quality biodiversity, et cetera. There is a process through the Convention on Biological Diversity where they actually have gone around the world and identified what scientists have determined are the most ecologically and biologically significant areas. So there are maps of where those areas exist. In the Arctic, it's a little bit more tricky, especially because you have sort of ice-dependent communities, you have a lot of, you know, migration of species, et cetera. So one of the questions has really been, how can you create more dynamic MPAs that maybe either change over time or change because of the movement of species, et cetera. So that's one point I wanted to make. Also, I briefly mentioned the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and that will have the ability to, or likely have the ability to set up new marine protected areas, and it will enable sort of states working obviously with their scientists, NGOs, and other stakeholders to identify where those areas are. So hopefully they will be finding the most significant areas and putting forward those proposals and proposed management measures along with it. I also just wanted to mention something with respect to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. The scientific committee is, you know, sort of in the stages of forming right now and establishing itself and trying to determine sort of questions it'll answer and the science it will do. Part of that discussion has been, you know, what relationship will there be to studying sort of within national jurisdiction, because there is a realization that sort of the continental shelves and the slopes, you know, that will have these fisheries resources, or that the states will be fishing within their own national waters, will have an impact in terms of the Central Arctic Ocean. And then lastly, I'm the biggest proponent of marine protected areas. It's something I've spent a lot of my life working on, but you also, or we all, I hopefully will recognize, there's always going to be use. So even while we're thinking about marine protected areas, how can we look to sustainable use? Because at the end of the day, if we aren't doing these activities in a sustainable manner, you know, we can probably have marine protected areas, but we're going to lose the battle. So I would also just emphasize in the conversation of protected areas, let's also talk about the sustainability of the activities we are doing. Thank you.
Okay, next goes around protected areas. It happened to be a passion. On the loopholes in the Arctic Ocean, on the seabed is a different legislation than the marine protection or the fishery agreement. And basically the UNCLOS, for the Arctic Ocean, at the moment, luckily, it's kind of self-protected because all the surrounding countries have put in overlapping claims. And anyone who kind of think that is an indication of trouble, you should think that's an indication of hope, because the countries will need to agree on the solution, and likely that will take 25, 30 years. So then you have it protected for that period. And even after that, then you have nations who is responsible. So I think, in a way, that's good. When you come to the part of the Arctic, the global oceans, North Atlantic, Pacific, or Antarctica, where you have particularly spreading reaches or crusts on the seabed, deep sea mining is a big issue. And I think the legislation in the world, at least at the moment, is not good enough. One thing is to protect something, but also the actual mining operations. They are modern, but they're also basically old-fashioned. If you are to take out resources there because we need it, maybe we should rethink how to take out resources from the deep sea minerals totally, not produce a lot of waste on the way. So that's a challenge, again, for those with creative minds.
Thank you. Susie. And actually, I'd like to come to NASA and see whether actually NASA has a role to play here in spotting mining activities, in being able to identify areas that might potentially be productive and indeed for marine protected areas. And then I'd like to come to the floor. Susie, after you.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the comment about the percentages of protection. We don't necessarily need to aim for 30%. It has to be the right proportion. 30% of the ocean is a good thing to aim for. I think these targets are useful to some degree, but we have to go for the right areas. I think the discussion on MPAs, particularly in the Southern Ocean, as I said earlier, has become very, very difficult, very polarized. And I think there is a need for some new approaches. Perhaps one thing that could be looked at is we do know there are some areas. Jane showed the picture earlier of the icefish nests in the Weddell Sea. That is unique, very special. We know exactly where it is. It is potentially very vulnerable to damage. Those sorts of areas should just be protected quite quickly. We have all the information that's necessary to protect those areas now. There are other areas in the wider Weddell Sea MPA proposal that hasn't been agreed yet. Maybe there are needs for more research to understand exactly how we could protect those areas most effectively, whether it does need to be such a large area, which does seem to be a problem for some countries to protect these very, very large areas and restrict fishing across them. Is there a way that we could have some form of interim protection for those other areas beyond the very, very vulnerable ones, where we can implement research and monitoring as part of the package? Design the monitoring that we need to do, the research that we need to do upfront as those areas are designated, and then undertake that and modify the boundaries, decide exactly what protection needs to be implemented in the longer term as part of a integrated program of interim protection that then leads on to a better understanding of what we can do to make it work. I think focusing research and monitoring in protected areas is absolutely critical. This has been discussed a lot in CAMLA, and there needs to be a clear understanding of what that means in practice. What does it really mean? What information is actually required, and what's practical? It's not possible to just keep saying we need more information and to use that as an obstacle to designating protected areas. It needs to be practical. It needs to be something that is achievable, and that countries can actually get behind doing the research that's needed, and then move on with some action. And I think, Prem also mentioned measures like seabird mitigation, seabird bycatch mitigation. There are other measures out there which will also achieve conservation objectives. And as Elizabeth said, some sustainable fishing needs to continue. We need to embed protected areas into a much broader integrated management system of looking after the entire ecosystem, with a number of different measures, not just MPAs, but all of the other mechanisms as well. Thank you.
Let me add something here. Some years ago, I reviewed the petition to put polar bears on the endangered species list. I also was asked to review the response by the Alaskan Oil and Gas Association. And they are good. They have very good scientists. And what makes it easy for them to respond is they only need to neutralize the argument that there's change. They do not need to prove there's no change. They only need to say there's enough doubt to prohibit, or to discourage any, measure to protect the polar bears in this case. And that's a very difficult thing for us to argue, and this is why I like how the IPCC report says there's virtually no doubt, there's some doubt, there's little doubt. That's the right language I think we need to implement for this discussion. The challenge that we face when we talk about climate change, changes, implementations to save polar bears or whatever, is we are scientists, we talk about errors, we talk about uncertainties. That is used against us, because we hear, unless you tell me the exact year with no uncertainty when the Arctic will be ice-free, I believe that you don't know what you're doing. There's so much error still in your data. And for me, my response sometimes is, if you go to the doctor and you have high blood pressure, your cholesterol is through the roof, and you better change your diet or your habits, or you will get a stroke. will I then tell the doctor, unless you tell me the exact date of the stroke and its severity, I won't believe you. And I think that's a challenge we are facing right now. And that makes this conversation so difficult.
I will speak here as with the head of executive director of the French Polar Institute, not ice memory, obviously. Regarding the MPAs, I see two aspects that are quite important. The first one is political. We know that the Rossi MPA was obtained because Barack Obama discussed with the president of China to get it. During the Winter Olympic Games, the Prince Albert II was in China and had a meeting with Xi Jinping. And the MPA topic was on the table, and that's what we need. And I want to thank the Prince for that. Second level is about the means. We spoke about monitoring. Monitoring in these areas is quite challenging. You know, you need to have oceanographic vessels, capacities. And if I take the example in France, we don't have this capacity. So I spent part of the last year to try to convince our parliament members that, especially for the topic of MPAs, we just need to invest in a dedicated vessel to do the survey, the monitoring, long-term monitoring. Otherwise, we try to protect something we don't understand.
Thank you. Now, as usual, we started off, I thought we've got loads and loads of time, but I've already had one time reminder. Questions from the floor, and then I'm going to go very specifically to individual members of the panel. So if you can make your questions as quick as possible from the floor to get as many of you in as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've just got a quick question stemming on something, Helen, that you mentioned. Love the idea of, if you can't beat them, join them. I actually hold local office, partly for that. But question is, we've spoken a lot about where policy isn't, the lack of communication between policy and science. And coming from the science perspective, what politicians aren't understanding about us. But flipping that around, what are we not understanding about the politicians? What do we need to make our communications better, but understanding their perspective? Thank you.
Oh, right. That's a hot potato, isn't it? Yes, I do.
I do talk to politicians, but one of the things I've learned is that as scientists, we try to talk data, numbers, science, and there are many politicians who haven't come into politics through the science pathway. They've come through the arts pathway, and they respond more to communication in what's called an emotional response rather than numbers and logic. And so you have to tap emotional response, which basically means storytelling. So I think it helps if you frame all the examples you need to tell, rather than telling them, the Earth's going to warm by such and such. And you think about a story, your personal experience or an experience to them, and you tell the story.
Thank you very much. I remember working with Lord Stern in 2008, and I was saying this all needs to be about polar bears, and he said, no, this has got to be about economics. I think there's a really important to get the mix. There were some more questions out there earlier. Gentleman in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Antonio Quesada. I am the COMNAPS chair associated to the Antarctic Treaty System. I would like to thank you very much for the panel. I think it's very useful, very interesting. But I have a comment and a question, a reflection, in fact. One of that is that you have already been mentioning that one of the key points in the governance of the polar regions is consensus. We are talking about dialogue. But in fact, we are having a dialogue among us, and we are all the same. We are in the same side of the balance. My reflection is, do you think that we can manage to go on in the consensus system, but thinking on another way, because this is not the way of getting consensus. Getting stronger one side of the balance doesn't provide an open possibility for changing. We can do a lot of science, we can do a lot of policy interaction, but if we don't get the consensus, we get nothing. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think I'm going to come to you, Prem, on that one. How do you build consensus outside what is a comfortable, essentially a comfortable audience here because we all think the same way. So how do you get to your politician? How do you get to your ethnic minority? And maybe if one or two other members of the panel could think about that as well. And anyone else out there, please put your hand up and a mic will come to you.
Is this, yeah, okay. Yeah, when it comes to getting a consensus from people on, I suppose, the other side of the fence, I would say that a lot of it comes from, you know, the image of a polar scientist, and it can, again, be this, it can be a lot of presumptions and preconceived ideas of your background. Perhaps you might come across as being quite privileged, and that can feed into a distancing where it's not a case of, you know, do you or don't you understand the science behind the climate change? It's one issue of, well, this person who's talking to me about how I need to change my behavior and change my lifestyles hasn't experienced my lifestyle, so how can they comment on that? And I think that's why it's really important in, you know, when it comes to conservation, when it comes to climate change, you do have all those sections of society involved, because if you look at a lot of even climate activist groups in the UK, they will take actions that will turn so many people within the community against them. Extinction Rebellion, for example, did some protests where they were stood on top of subway trains in England, and that just prevented working class people from going to work. And it's actions that, and you know, that came about as a group action. So clearly there was a group there and they discussed this plan, and there wasn't one person who really occurred to them that, you know, impacting the lives of, I suppose, you know, normal people is going to be impacted in that way. And I suppose it can be really difficult to understand the psychology of people on the other side of the fence unless you've lived through their experiences. You know, if you're a climate activist and you say it's absolutely fine for me to disrupt someone's lives because the end of the planet is a bigger issue than you not getting this train, what they probably don't realize is that person not being able to get the train to go to their job where they're cleaning, you know, an office, they could be on the breadline, they could lose their support, they could lose, you know, being able to feed their family just by missing that one train. So really, we just need to call on, whether it's climate scientists or even climate activist groups, to really look inwards and reflect and look at who are you talking to. And if you don't have those people within your group, just bloody go out there and get them in.
Thanks, Brad. Anyone else, very quickly, because I know we've got some other questions to come. Do you want to go?
Yes, quickly as possible. I would like to say again what Judy Brigham-Grit said yesterday. We don't need to talk with the brain, we need to talk with the heart and the gut. And you know, politicians, they are human beings. And they have children, they may have grandchildren. And the key question is what their grandchildren or children will think about the parents and grandparents in decades from now. What did they do? What action did they do at their level to make that the planet is still livable for them?
Two examples. The long-term strategy we have, every teacher goes to a university, make the teacher understand, and the next generation will know better. Very simple, but take a very long time. And that we do already. The second is we have a group of reindeer herders linked to in one of our networks. They have food in this food kind of revitalization of their pride of coming from communities, but that is also by producing a TV show. They are now getting to TV shows that take 50,000 viewers. No, sorry, 50 million viewers. The best an Arctic Council report ever can dream up is 500. So speak to people's stomach.
Just one last point, I'd say, at least in international negotiations, I think it's relationship building. When you have that basis, you know about their family, maybe you've gone for a walk together, et cetera, you develop that rapport that enables you, I think, to listen a little bit more, and as Prem was getting at, to sort of understand them and where they're coming from. So I would say developing the personal relationship is extremely important to get to consensus. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, so sorry, we just have 10 minutes left, so maybe if you could, in answering this question, perhaps move toward your final wrap, if that's okay with you, Tom. This question is from Jose, who's following us online. He says, all right, how do we accelerate the development of polar policies to keep pace with the big changes that are actually occurring right now? How do we speed everything up?
Who would like to take that? Well, thank you for volunteering. I'm going to volunteer you. Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you. But quickly, because otherwise I'm going to get into trouble.
I can be quick because I'm not sure I have a great answer for this. Yeah, I think it's just continually to try to work in the existing fora that we have and to be forward looking, as I was mentioning, in terms of what more might we need. You know, are the establishments that we currently have enough, or do we need to reinvent them to be able to take more, stronger, faster actions? And, you know, people have been posing this idea about consensus. Should we always have consensus or not? One might argue either way in terms of consensus, make sure that everyone is playing together. On the other hand, it might stop you from making progress, so you could look at the flip sides of consensus. Thanks.
Susie.
It's a great question. I'm not sure it has at all an easy answer. One thing I did want to mention was I think the question that I hear most often from early career researchers, particularly not just early career researchers, but others too, is how do I get my science into something that's useful for policymakers? And I think there is often no substitute really for actually coming along to these meetings, to these forums, to the Antarctic Treaty or to CAMLA or maybe to the Arctic Council, to see exactly what is going on, to build relationships with people, to actually have the opportunity to see how consensus works. I do think at the moment consensus is probably the best option that we have, but actually seeing that in practice is an incredible way to understand the process that you just don't get from reading a report, for example. And I think that energy and the willingness of so many people to contribute to that process, we have to make it easier for those people to join in, because that's where the engine of all this work is coming from. There huge willingness to be involved and to contribute. I lead the group within SCAR that interacts directly with the Antarctic Treaty System. SCAR has a number of fellowships where it encourages early career researchers to do work alongside or to contribute to science that will then hopefully be useful in policy making. We're trying to look at ways that we can develop new scholarships and fellowships for researchers to actually come to these meetings and to come with, for example, the SCAR delegation to the Antarctic Treaty meeting.
I'm getting cross looks.
Sorry,
so,
I'll wrap up. But I think
I can interpret a cross look across a cross room. So.
But these scholarships, CAMLA has the same thing, where they have scholarships to encourage early career researchers into the room and to build those relationships. And I think that's definitely the way forward. Important. Apologies.
No, I'm going to come to the whole panel and ask for 2 answers to the question. One answer.
Sure, it's just for the lunch break.
Oh, people don't mind about lunch. They had breakfast. They're fine. I ate yesterday. But I'm going to come to the panel and ask each individual in the panel for 2 answers, the question of how you do management response in the face of uncertainty. But I'd just like, Jane, I think you probably had a thought on that question.
In terms of policymakers, I think you need to know who to talk to. Don't waste your time talking to the wrong people, which I think a lot of scientists do. They talk to each other. Find out who is going to make a difference and talk directly to them.
That's brilliant. Right, okay. I'm going to go round the panel. How do we get management responses in the face of uncertainty and make it relevant to the polar regions? Please, Helen. And keep it brief, because I'm going to cut you off otherwise I will get cut off.
I always get told not to mention uncertainty. You're going to talk about unknowns and not make it sound too much like we don't know what we're talking about. So try and be clear and concise. I think that would be a good thing to do.
I think there's different levels of uncertainty. There's scientific uncertainty, but then there's a lot of uncertainty which doesn't need to exist, which just comes about from a lack of communication between different groups and different communities. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty that can be cleared up just by having more people involved in the process.
I could just mention industry hates uncertainty. They don't always like regulation, but they like the certainty of knowing regulation in advance of engaging in activities. So I might go for sort of working with industry and developing regulations so they have that certainty.
Invest in the future generations, since we are old, but else I would very much support Jane's actually argument.
Yeah, definitely invest in future generations. I agree with that one. I think also be clear about what the uncertainty is, be honest that there is uncertainty, make space to talk about the uncertainty, and then don't be afraid to take actions, management actions now, even if there is uncertainty. We have to put things in place now and be prepared to change them in the future.
I think the challenge we're facing is we need to provide, the science is complex. We need to provide our information in a digestible way so that people, everyone can understand it. Laymen, stakeholders, lawmakers, etc. I think that's, and we are failing at that at times. We're preaching too much to the choir in a way, and we need to be better at communicating our science, our results to the layman public.
I would say hope, awareness, connectivity, action, and that's what we do in the frame of ice memory. Thank you.
Wow, that's great. I wasn't able to write fast enough, so I hope you've all remembered what you said, because then you can tell me over lunch. Thank you so much to the panel for your input. I really enjoyed this, and I feel I have learned so much just by listening to you. I'm very sorry that we have to cut this short, because I would be happy to sit here for another hour and listen to this conversation. Thank you very much to everyone out there in the room and online, and thank you to you, Jane, for being with us. I hope that you enjoy lunch, and this session is ending 26 seconds early. So.
Bravo! Tom, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for being a wonderful host and timekeeper, Ambassador Tom Riley. Thanks to all of our panelists as well for this other incredible session.